Attorney Amihan April Alcazar, sa lahat ng bumubuo ng The Education Channel at sa ating mga manunood, magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Una sa lahat, nais kong batiin si Attorney April para sa paglulunsad ng kanyang kahanga-hangang proyektong The Education Channel. Mahalaga ang episode natin ngayong gabi dahil ito ang premier broadcast dito sa ating bansa. Sa pamamagitan ng programang ito, hindi lamang tayo naghahatid ng edukasyon sa mga mag-aaral ng bansa. Tinatalakay din natin ang mahalagang usapin. Ngayon gabi ay tatalakay natin ang estado ng edukasyon sa bansa na humaharap sa matinding hamon na dulot ng COVID-19. Para sa akin, hindi lamang ang pagpapatuloy ng edukasyon ang dapat nating tutukan sa new o better normal. Mahalaga ring talakayin natin kung paano nating iaangat ang kalidad ng edukasyon sa bansa. Paano ba magiging mas matatag ang sektor ng edukasyon sa harap ng mga krisis na tulad ng kinakaharap natin? Samahan po natin si Attorney April sa pagtalakay at pagsuri ng mga usaping ito. Bilang chairman ng Senate Committee on Basic Education, Arts and Culture, ako po ay inyong katawang sa ating pagsisikap na iangat ang kalidad ng ating edukasyon. Maraming salamat at magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Stay safe.
as well, all the guests coming from the industry, the education. So since last year, the 196 organizations and leaders, right, they make jumps from 1 to 2, right, or even 3. Can you imagine the number of people are going through mental health issues? So that's how will we do this? So we research, that there are certain things that have already been implemented like this as a way to inform as well other leaders in the other agencies. I love this, coming from the Department of Trade and Industry. They're saying that when the nation develops its people, the people is developed. So thank you for today. God bless you. Thank you so much.
And we're happy that for the second quarter of 2021, we were able to among our workers to go out, especially those who have not been vaccinated. Overseas po, alam naman po natin na the pandemic has an impact. We speak about 2 million na rin po yung atin pong nare-reach.
So these are the things that we would like to invite everyone, if these are very important to you.
Good evening. It's Wednesday night, and we're here at AAA Live, where your academic goals are advanced and achieved. So this is your host, Attorney Amian April M. Alcazar. And so tonight, we will be having a very good segment of interviews as well as features from the United States, where we have a very good connection. So first and foremost, during our first segment, we will be actually discussing the field of study of outdoor education. And here tonight, joining us from San Francisco, California, USA, is our friend, Ms. Gaia Pacienti. So can you please give our viewers some greetings, Gaia?
Hi everyone. Hi everyone from California.
Nice to meet you. And I think you're actually going to end your summertime next week already in California. So it must be getting cool there, is it?
A little bit. Actually, up here in Northern California, though, we have something of a warm spell every October. So it's actually been really beautiful. Even though we've had some rain and storm, we've had some sunshine too. So.
Okay, and of course, San Francisco, famous for, of course, the Golden Gate Bridge and the Fisherman's
Fog.
Yes, and the fog of San Francisco. So talking about some nice weather there, I think you're looking forward. And of course, hello from sunny Philippines as always. So we've lost a lot of our tropical storms now. So we're moving towards a cool, well, in our case, cool front. So I think that's very apt to be discussing the weather, because we are going to be speaking about outdoor education for tonight, Gaia. So, but please tell us first and foremost, what was the field of study that you undertook your undergraduate, and how did you come about to have that interest first and foremost in what you studied in your bachelor's degree?
Yes, thanks for that question. So I've always loved reading. I've always loved books. And so when I decided to enter community college, actually, it was a teacher there named Mr. Meeks who inspired me in literature and poetry. So even though there wasn't so much of a career target necessarily with the idea of studying and pursuing a degree in literature, it was still something I was very passionate about and could envision myself enjoying and spending a lot of time with, right? So that was what motivated my decision to pursue a bachelor's in modern literature.
Okay. And so from that, of course, what would be like the takeaway in terms of like the value of what you've learned and studied through your first degree?
Sure. Well, I would say that, ultimately, I think so much about the American education system is really focused on, career and how are you going to make money after your degree and so forth. And so there's just so much pressure for young people to really consider, maybe the quickest way to success. But to me, in my heart, in my nature, enjoying what I was learning about was always priority. And so, for me, it just opened up so many doorways of thought and philosophy and humanity, and so that's really what I took away from that degree, was just a deeper understanding of the world philosophically.
Okay. And so after your degree then, you did undertake like a stint outside of the United States. Can you tell us about this experience? Because this is immersive experiential learning on your end.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So I am fortunate enough to have been born a dual citizen of another country, of Italy. And so it was always a lifelong dream to move to Italy and to experience life in a new culture, in a new country. So I decided at 29 years old, a little later than I thought, to make the jump. And I just went ahead and, moved my whole life there. And I spent 2 years in Rome, I spent 1 year in Barcelona, and then 10 months in Edinburgh, Scotland.
And so that whole European sojourn, okay, as maybe you would call it, because it was like traveling and, of course, living in 3 countries. So what was the most important value, again, of this experience multiculturally for you, and looking at it now from the lens, I guess, of like a young person, and eventually if you relate that to your career path? Yes.
Yeah, sure. So I've always held the belief that everyone should learn another language and everyone should be immersed in another culture. I think it's extremely important to build character, to understand one's values, and even just to have a clearer reflection of one's own life and culture and so forth. And so, for me, it was just such I would say a buffet of joy to be able to learn a new language and to be able to see the world and express my experiences in the world in such a new way. And, as a young person, having that experience, I think it's only enriched, my desire to, open myself to the possibility of, transcultural learning, multidisciplinary learning, and especially immersive learning with regard to different cultures within the same country even.
So that must have been like really very enriching and fulfilling on your end. But of course, the call of home, because of the United States being like your homeland or your home country. So how did this come about in terms of like your decision now to pursue further studies, and specifically why outdoor education?
Sure. So right before I moved to Europe, I had worked for 2 years as a surf therapist. So this is something quite strange. It was, even at the time, this was 2014 to 2016, it was pretty unheard of. But essentially, it was a way to not only introduce the sport or activity of surfing, but also to learn how to be in community with the ocean and a new element in a new way, as well as in community with one another that are in the group.
So you must have heard that the Philippines is a very famous destination for surfers and divers, and anything to do with aquatic, because we are an archipelago.
Yes, and I'm so excited to visit. I can't wait.
And all of these restrictions are more lenient, right? Yeah, so the surfer therapy. So what kind of immersive experience do most who participate in surfer therapy take away from?
So it really depends on one's motivation and where one is coming from. So the surf therapy I did before I left for Europe was more kinesthetic. So it was more focused on the body, on strength and tone. And, I was working with young people with developmental disabilities. So a lot of that is not only spatial awareness, but social awareness. And I was also working with adolescents in drug and alcohol rehab. And so with that came a lot of, behavioral issues and so forth. But so I had walked away from that experience so overcome with a sense of joy and fulfillment for really the first time in my life, where I had these adolescents, these young people say, I never want to do drugs again, I just want to surf. And to know that I was able to be a part of that process, to facilitate that process, meant so much to me. So it really stuck with me through my time of soul searching, let's say during my travels throughout Europe. And when I was finally ready to decide on a program of study and on a career path, when I discovered that there was a field called outdoor education, I was taken aback. I couldn't believe it, and I really knew that was for me. So that's when I decided to pursue this program in Scotland.
Yeah. So of course we know that outdoor education actually the beginnings actually started like from many decades ago. So maybe you can tell us a little bit really about the origins of outdoor education and how that has developed right now to a very serious field of study, Kaya.
Sure. So it's, the origins are disputed. There's a few different perspectives and ways to understand sort of what the origins are, but maybe I can just begin by kind of offering a definition of outdoor education. So it's just, I describe it in my words as sort of the active practice and purposeful knowledge of human engagement in participatory interconnection with life on Earth. So essentially, it's something so broad that it can even be attached to activities and pedagogic approaches as disparate as adventure therapy or corporate training or outdoor pursuits, recreational camping, and many elements of formal schooling. So it's incredibly, diverse and wide an umbrella of pedagogy, but also experiential learning. And so it actually has origins. One of the origins is it was originally taken to be by an educator. He had decided that, all young people at their core are good. However, it's society that turns young people bad. And so he was the first one to really say, okay, let's take these young people to the woods, to the forest, and let's give them a very structured life, and let's give them some responsibility. And in this way, they might develop themselves to be upright citizens, right? Citizens that contribute to society, okay? Yeah. So this was really the first time, this is about the turn of the century, maybe I think it was 1930s. This was the first time that something like this had been done. And so what happened was then the U.S. Army decided to adopt this structure, this format, right? And they used it towards developing what we now know as, Army Training Boot Camp, right? And so, these practices have taken on many, many forms, throughout our modern history. But essentially, in my view and in my research, learning through nature, learning through the environment is something we have been doing since the dawn of humankind. Okay, so this is nothing new, but now we've given it a formal title, right, of outdoor education. So
yes, and from what you would call about the Army boot camp training, I think eventually also it took on many other schools in terms of organizations and clubs and forms, right? Like imagine the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the Orienteering Club as being manifestations of outdoor education or learning from the environment. So in its current form, Gaia, so now that it has actually evolved into a field of study, so what would be now the present state of this field of study as it is actually learned and taught in different countries?
Sure. So, it's hard for me to speak to all countries and how it's learned and taught in all countries. I'll only speak from, let's say, this Western perspective, because that's ultimately what the program that I was immersed in, that was the roots of a lot of the theories, historical and contemporary, that we were, learning about. So I'll just speak to, there's many different branches or currents, let's say, of experiential learning and of outdoor learning. One of those might be place-based education, which is maybe a bit different from critical place-based education, where it's more politically involved. There's maybe hands-on learning, which is a bit different than learning by doing or even experiential learning. So there's all these little intricacies and differences. So in my program, some of the courses that we had were, development of academic research skills, which always comes with a higher degree of education. In my case, a master's. And we also did a course that was so fascinating called Interpreting the Landscape, where we developed a greater understanding of a landscape as medium, right? Landscape as medium, as subject, and as backdrop for outdoor learning. And we especially focused on influences like the geological, geomorphological, biological, and human, historical, and contemporary, relationships to the landscape. And also the changes that have occurred in the landscape and its character and ownership and the demands of use and environmental protection and the constraints of those due to local, national, international legislation. So, there's so many different, approaches to this subject that one might pursue. But it was just such a wonderful delight to have been exposed to all of these different facets and ways to, when you look at a landscape, how that can be and how that can be addressed. It's so rich and so deep and so varied. And
so would we say that geography actually is destiny in a way, right? Because where you are actually located to a large extent will determine both the freedom and the constraints that you might experience in terms of the geographical, geomorphological character traits, right? That you will experience. So out of all of this wide spectrum and breadth of learnings, when did you decide to actually focus on what would be most interesting to undertake in your home country related to outdoor education?
Sure. So I would say, the road to coming to this decision, even just deciding on the field of outdoor ed was extremely long and excruciating for me personally. It took me a long time to come to the realization that outdoor education was really right for me and was something that spoke really, really powerfully to my life and my heart and my experiences. But now having undergone, this master's thesis and really dug into a very, very specific niche aspect of what outdoor environmental education can be, and in this modern world, in this context that I am in the United States, for me, I've developed quite a fascination with indigenous knowledge systems. So basically understanding, how it is that indigenous nations see the world and their epistemologies and ontologies. What is reality? How do you interpret reality? And what is the history there? What is the history with the land? What has happened? And, where is my place in this very, very long story? And so, what I've just discovered, so as I was saying before, there are many different kinds of facets, right? Place-based education, critical place-based education. So critical place-based education is a pedagogy that seeks these objectives of decolonization and re-inhabitation through critical and place-based approaches. So it's a way for educators to reflect on the relationship between the kind of education they pursue and the kinds of places we inhabit and leave behind for future generations. So this really, especially with regard to, United States history of colonization and, the oppression and continual oppression of Native nations, for me, this is an extremely important, significant, especially this time in the world right now that we're in, politically and globally, that this be looked at and worked with. And I just feel very strongly that this path is one that I wish to pursue and really dedicate my life to. So to be honest, I just finished my thesis only a couple months ago. So not even 1 month ago. So I'm still very much on a path of understanding, where I can apply myself in that way. But I do know that absolutely I want to work in the intersections of conservation education alongside Indigenous nations and, to support awareness, advocacy, and ultimately to, become a true ally. So that's just, the place that I found my path. After a very, very long time and a lot of effort and energy into investing, just really try to understand, where do my passions lie and where can I see myself creating the most value, through this field.
So I think, do you think that this kind of awareness and consciousness, especially because of what has been happening to our environment, and we're really talking about like the physical environment vis-a-vis how it interacts with like society in general, and as you mentioned, like what would be the effect on future generations. So it's actually a worldwide concern. And also in the Philippines, we would find like common threads about like colonization and condition of the indigenous people, right? And I already mentioned about like how about the physical environment and its degradation, right? So I think maybe you can discuss some of the specific issues that you might have found in your research, as you were saying about the intersection between indigenous communities and their conditions vis-a-vis the history of colonization, at least in the American context.
Sure. So it's a very intense, long-winded, and interesting question.
Very interesting topic to discuss.
Yes, but I will try my best to surmise and make it short.
Long millennia of history.
Yes.
Yes.
So, I'll just say, speaking from my own research, my conclusion ultimately was that, I am now beginning to understand and really see for the first time, due to my own question asking, really, due to my own curiosity, no one has ever prompted me towards this sort of line of questioning either in my schooling nor in my career as an instructor or teacher to varying degrees in my life here in the United States. So now, because of my research and pursuing this, I'm beginning to understand that, indigenous people of the land are, by extension, the land itself, right? So through this understanding and continuing to understand and deepen my knowledge or, passion for this, I'm discovering this newfound responsibility that as an educator is choosing to be an educator and choosing to work alongside the environment and thereby truly seeking to embody stewardship, reciprocity, and love for land means unequivocally a responsibility to critically engage, historic and social politics which impact First Nations. So I believe that traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous traditional knowledge systems, they are, if I'll use a metaphor, like the tallest trees of experience with the deepest roots of acquired wisdom, which can offer lessons to benefit everyone, right, towards more sustainable living and with greater satisfaction. So specifically here in the United States, as an immigrant culture, non-Native Americans must start, I believe, to engage in their own process of becoming what we say indigenous to place. There's a wonderful writer named Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she shared that, for all of us, becoming indigenous to place means living as if your children's future mattered, right? To take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it. So, in this process, this very long, arduous process of healing, not only the land, but also our relationship to it, and also all people, our relationship to all the peoples of it, I believe, will begin to gain more direction of how to become better stewards and to fulfill, assume our roles as kin, within this eco-social community. So I hope I've answered your question. That's
the very essence, actually, of conservation in a way. Like, what's the rationale of conservation? And as you mentioned, like being the stewards of the land and the relationship between ourselves and the future generation, as well as the ones that preceded us. So they are a reflection of that. So moving forward, I think, what would be your advice, I think, for like young people? Because you talked about like the arduous road, I guess, before coming full circle to determining what fields of study would be most interesting, what would you actually want to contribute to the world, I think. So now that you are in a place where it's possible to actually speak from experience, how to undertake a search and maybe to find what would be most appropriate for a young person
Sure.
This process. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. Thank you. So, I've always struggled with learning in this particular educational system. I actually had developed learning differences. Even as much as I've always loved to learn, loved to read, explored my curiosity, I've also kind of collided, in a lot of ways with the way our educational system handles people who ultimately cannot learn in the way that they are offering, right? And so coming to grips with that, and then, deciding that anyway, I'm going to pursue, something that I want. It was always a dream of mine to pursue higher education. So that was just my, personal goal and dream of mine. But I didn't know for the longest time in what field. I've had many different experiences and I have many different interests. And so, having, to decide, okay, at 30 years old now, I've had, 10 years since I've graduated from my bachelor's and 10 years to experience life and to really hone in on where I can imagine my life going and where I want to really invest and input my energy and time. So even after all that time and even at 30 years old, it really was about fundamentally where my passion lied. So having that experience in Europe allowed me to reflect on my time prior to that. And really my experience doing surf therapy, because I realized, oh my gosh, that was the most meaningful time for me professionally and socially and on many levels. And so when I discovered, so from that point, I basically spent, I would say 1.5 years just researching master's programs, just researching fields of study, because this is the kind of person I am, because I'm highly indecisive. So when I realized outdoor education was a field which I had no idea until 30 years old, I knew it was for me. And I knew that was what, would determine the rest of my life in career. So really fundamentally my advice for all young people is really to reflect on what your passion is and just run with it. Just run with it, because you cannot go wrong. Because even when you think you're making mistakes, it's all a learning process, and without a doubt, you will benefit from it absolutely in the future. So, I really firmly believe that when you make up your mind and when you really have the heart of a lion king, right, you will fear nothing. You will fear nothing. Nothing in life will become too large. So I really encourage all young people that, the world needs your vibrant life force, your idealism. So please continue, to feed your curiosity, to run with your passion, because without a doubt, you will find a community of people with a similar vision and values that are just waiting for your contributions, in a way that only you can, provide, your unique skill set. And so, so that's really maybe the crux of my advice for all.
So, yes, so I think one very striking statement that you mentioned was about like the educational system, because of course, coming from an educator's perspective, it's sometimes difficult to encourage young people to say like mistakes. You could also do that. And sometimes the educational system won't be so constructive for you, because there are certain things that may not actually be agreeable to you. And yet, it's better to just like undergo this process still.
Right. I think we often get stuck in what we consider to be formal or accepted education, but again, even just taking a step outside, even just taking a look at, a tree or a plant or maybe an animal and asking yourself questions and really provoking curiosity, that is an education. That too, in and of itself, constitutes a greater awareness, a greater knowledge. So just, I guess, never underestimate, what the education of life and the natural environment can provide as well.
So I think like for outdoor education, maybe this is really the education that you will find outside possibly the confines of the traditional building or classroom. So that's something that we can encourage the young people to really try to explore even to a limited extent, depending on their constraints. So I think it's been really such a nice discussion, Gaia. I hope that our viewers had an insight into the possibility really of outdoor education. And as you mentioned, it doesn't even have to be a degree, right? Any kind of learning that involves our interaction with the environment can constitute outdoor education. So it's been such a pleasure to have you in our program. So I hope that you'll be able to contribute tremendously to the path that you have decided that you're going to take on. Actually, we have a lot of involvement with indigenous communities here. So we look forward to, again, maybe having another discussion sometime when you're able to come to the Philippines and contribute to one of our conferences, especially on indigenous communities, right?
That would bring me so much joy. I really hope for that. Yes, thank you.
So we look forward to see you again very soon, okay? And stay safe and healthy. Okay? So just stay on and we'll be right back.
They say.
At some of the other states around the Southeast that are working to support flood resilience and flood mitigation projects in their communities and in their states. And so I'm going to pass it over to Christiana Huber from the Pew Charitable Trust, and she's going to give us that overview. Christiana.
Yes, thanks, Logan, and hello, everyone. Thank you to Mayor Land and Mayor Reels and Roger and Tony for all of your presentations. It's really helpful to hear more about the challenges that you all are facing and also some of these creative solutions that we see happening in Nashville and in other places across the state. And creative in terms of the decision making and the policy and finding the funding to start addressing these issues. But today, I'm going to be sharing more about what some other states are doing that we think might be able to inform what Tennessee could start to do on a bigger scale to address flooding. So I am Christiana Huber. I work with Pew Charitable Trusts, and I'm on the Flood Prepared Communities team at Pew. So just briefly, our our program's goal is to reduce the impact of weather-related catastrophes, such as floods and hurricanes, on the U.S. taxpayer and on the environment by better preparing communities. And we do that by looking at both federal and state policy, and are really focused on flood insurance, infrastructure policy, pre-disaster mitigation, and on using nature-based solutions to address flooding. So how is flooding affecting states? What are we seeing in other states? There is increasing pressure on states to reduce the cost of flooding. And that is because of this growing frequency and rising cost of disasters that a lot of states are seeing, and maybe not in specific communities, but at least statewide, these costs are going up in a lot of places. And at the same time, the federal government is looking to reduce disaster expenditures and increase investment in resilience and mitigation. So we have seen states respond in a variety of ways to start to get out ahead of these issues. But those state action seems to mostly fall into these four categories: designating some lead office or creating a coordinated interagency effort, figuring out how to plan for flooding statewide, how to assess those risks, and how to start to really write out what's needed in different areas and what different agencies need to do to address these challenges. States are funding flood resilience planning and pre-disaster mitigation projects. And finally, they are providing resources for communities and coordinating among communities that are starting to determine what more locally needs to be done to address flooding, and make sure that those communities are speaking to each other, and as they're probably connected by roads or sewer systems or rivers or any other infrastructure or natural systems, making sure that's coordinated. So that work in states seems to happen the best if it follows four main principles. And the first one is to lead with science. And this can mean lots of things, but it is most important that as a state government determines what to do about flooding, it is thinking about future risk based on models and projections. And that both should think about changing precipitation patterns, but also should consider development. More development and more impervious surface can really exacerbate flooding in an area and for everyone downstream and downhill. And on that same theme, really looking within watersheds. So determining what areas are all connected hydrologically, either via groundwater, by rivers, and areas within a state that where there's flooding in one part of it, certainly in another area could be impacted. So really making sure to look at that more regional scale when thinking about the solutions that are needed. The next principle is to plan comprehensively. And as you can see on this slide, that means looking at transportation systems, thinking about housing, different local economies and the state economy, what community infrastructure is needed in different towns. And this really this really relies on interdisciplinary and interagency planning, and also enabling multiple levels for communities as well as the state to be preparing for flooding and having these discussions together. It relies on lots of stakeholder engagement. The state needs to be talking with communities need to be talking with their residents. Everyone is affected by flooding and probably has a good sense of the challenges in their own backyard, and a sense of what resources are needed on the state level. Another element of this is to consider how flooding especially impacts lower income or disadvantaged neighborhoods, groups of people, communities, And that can also mean really looking at the difference between how urban areas are impacted and rural areas and what resources they each have. The next principle is to invest now. Now is a great time to invest in both flood resilience planning and in that modeling and developing a plan, and also in these projects that can reduce risk. It's really critical to break this cycle of disaster spending and pay for these things before the disaster. On this slide, there's this widely cited statistic from the National Institute of Building Sciences that found that for every dollar of federal funding invested in mitigating flooding, there was $6 in returns. Reaping these benefits means extended planning time horizons, really looking out ahead as different infrastructure planning or even regional or municipal planning is happening. And also incorporating that future risk in project design, especially for infrastructure that's really important. And if you're building a new hospital or a really critical road, making sure that is built to withstand floods that occur now and could be more severe in the future. And then this slide also includes planning for negative and positive growth, and that really just means as Nashville is looking at what areas maybe need to not have as many homes, there's also opportunities to develop other areas that are safer and don't have as much flood risk, and then you're able to use some of those green spaces that result from buyouts for maybe really beautiful parks or really exciting recreation opportunities. So there's some real benefits that come out of this with, really proactive and creative thinking out ahead. The last principle is to put nature to work. This slide overviews different green infrastructure, and those are designs that use nature or natural features to mimic natural surfaces or materials to capture, hold, and infiltrate rainwater instead of letting it run over roads and parking lots and really contribute to stormwater, or to adding in buffers or doing floodplain restoration along rivers to give rivers some space for when they flood. The slide also overviews blue infrastructure and gray infrastructure, but we are most focused on green infrastructure as a really as being a really beneficial way to address flooding, with lots of other benefits, like economic benefits and offering wildlife habitat and all kinds of other unintended, very positive consequences. So what are other states already doing? We'll look across, so Pew is working in many states. We are not working in all the states that are on this slide, but there are just stories from these states that are in blue that we think can relate to Tennessee for sure. So the first state to look at is South Carolina. There are lots of things that excite me about all the things these states are doing, but we do not have enough time for me to go through that all. So I'm going to just highlight a few especially exciting and relevant elements from each state. So South Carolina, last year, Governor McMaster signed the Disaster Relief and Resilience Act that creates this Office of Resilience, and that Office of Resilience and Chief Resilience Officer are charged with developing this statewide resilience risk reduction plan. And that plan will be looking at past and potential future losses associated with disasters. It will be developing recommendations for actions to increase the state's vulnerability to flooding. A piece of that is an estimate of the number of residential properties that could be eligible for floodplain buyouts, and an estimate of the cost. So looking at that statewide instead of only within a community, looking for funding strategies to do all these projects, and then trying to think through how to incorporate this into existing state policy. That bill also set up a Disaster Relief and Resilience Reserve Fund, which is funding that is set aside for communities that are struck by disasters that are federally declared that need some immediate recovery funding. But the Resilience Revolving Fund is a really exciting feature that provides low-interest loans and grants to local governments to perform floodplain buyouts and floodplain restoration projects. In North Carolina, they have the governor set up the North Carolina Office for Recovery and Resilience, which works with the Department of Environmental Quality to develop this North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan, which worked across agencies. All the cabinet agencies contributed to this and considered how flooding effects and other disasters affect their ability to serve the residents of North Carolina, and started to plan out a way to make those services more resilient, to make sure that they can serve residents in any kind of natural disaster. North Carolina also has 2 resilient communities programs, and one of them is very focused on providing consulting and technical assistance to coastal communities that need it, and the other is really focused on rural communities and training the officials and town staff in those places to learn more about flooding, learn more about the potential solutions out there, and learn how to identify the right funding sources to start to act locally. Texas's Water Development Board was tasked with developing the state's first ever regional and statewide plan. So Texas was divided into, I can't remember the number now, but a number of regions that are determined by watersheds, so areas that are hydrologically connected, and all of those regional resilience planning groups are developing their regional plans to determine what those flood vulnerabilities are and what the best projects would be to start to address that. And then the state will pull all those regional plans into one big statewide plan to determine what projects are prioritized, what policies need to change at the state level, and really direct the funding that's coming out of this flood infrastructure fund that Texas has also set up. In Florida, Florida set up the Resilient, in addition to passing a bill to complete a comprehensive statewide flood risk assessment and resilience plan. The state set up a grant program that supports community resilience planning, risk assessments, and local planning. And then also established the Florida Resilience Trust Fund to support both the statewide planning work and all these projects in communities. And they put $500 million of their American Rescue Plan money into that trust fund to support that work, and are getting started on that already. Virginia established a community flood preparedness fund, which they found recurring funding through by joining the regional greenhouse gas initiative. But through that initiative that they're just sort of ramping up over the years, there's a projected $75 million a year out of all of the proceeds from that that will be going into this flood preparedness fund. And this fund is really structured to help the most under-resourced communities. And at least 25% of those funds are directed to historically under-resourced and marginalized communities. And then there's preference for projects that are informed by some resilience planning and that incorporate nature-based solutions to get that really optimal those flood resilience benefits, as well as those natural and other co-benefits. So, and the last is Louisiana. Louisiana has lots of initiatives going on, but I'm just going to call out that the Governor John Bel Edwards set up this Council on Watershed Management in 2018, and that is just representatives from several agencies that have come together to develop this Louisiana Watershed Initiative, which is kind of similar to Texas, this more regional approach to creating coordinated, coherent, and long-term vision for resilience. It aims to create tools for communities and lots of data on flooding, and really have clear decision-making about what policy change is needed and what projects need to be funded first, and is really looking on this bigger regional watershed scale for more regional projects, maybe all along the same river, or a series of green infrastructure projects that can capture water in one more efficient and critical area versus just really only looking community by community. And that really emphasizes maximizing the natural function of floodplains and making sure that they can do their job and hold water that is from rivers that are jumping their banks. So that is my whirlwind tour of flood resilience in the South. There's much more happening in all those states. There's more details, but I didn't think we did not need to get into that all today. And the next steps here are how does this apply in Tennessee? All these other states have found these different paths to at least starting to get the information all in one place, getting agencies and communities talking to each other. And we're starting to think now, and I'll flip in a moment to my own email. We're curious to hear what elements of these work that other states are doing that Tennessee could emulate, and also how can we build on the work that's already happening at the state and really help the state prepare, because we know there's already some promising work in Tennessee, like TDEC has offered lower interest rates for resilient and green projects that are funded by the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. It's already been mentioned, but and I think Mayor Holden is on, but the resilience pilot project that's happening in Dyersburg that has these resilience benefits as well as these clean water benefits. There's some really good work already happening, and we're just looking at how to really expand that throughout the state, so the entire state can be safer and have these disaster cost savings. So I think that is all for me. That's my information, and I'll pass it back to Logan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christiana. So I think we've really kind of covered the gamut here. We've heard from some smaller rural communities who have been struggling to address these needs. We've heard from Nashville, who kind of has all the resources, and they're pooling a lot of different resources together to really do some large scale buybacks. And then we've taken a survey of what's going on in other states and how they're addressing it to bring some of their more rural and vulnerable communities up to speed with flood resilience and flood mitigation. And so as Flood Ready Tennessee kind of moves forward and tries to work with stakeholders at the local level, as well as working together with all of the relevant agencies to find the solutions that actually empower communities and will end up saving both property and lives. I think at this time we're gonna open it up to questions from anybody on the call who would like to ask any questions of those who've taught today. And I will be sending around both a recording of this session and all the contact information of everybody who was on, so that if you all would like to reach out, you can. But right now, if anybody would like to ask any questions, feel free, and we'll plan on wrapping up right about 3:30.
I was going to ask Roger about their elevation numbers. Is that the 100-year flood plan or 500-year flood plain? What numbers that they're using for their elevation on their buyback?
Yeah, in Nashville, we regulate to the 100-year with a 4-foot freeboard requirement for residential properties. And for commercial properties or non-residential properties, the requirement is to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation or the 100-year flood elevation. In the case where decisions relative to elevating versus buyout, if a structure was built pre-firm, for example, if it was built before there were any flood maps in existence, and it was built below what today is modeled and mapped as a 100-year flood elevation, then the requirement for a substantially damaged property would be to bring it into compliance with our floodplain ordinance. And it may, we've had houses that have had to be elevated as much as 8 to 10 feet. And so it's not uncommon to have one done that way. Our preference as a municipality that's running, a program of this nature, our preference for a routinely, flood-prone property, we would rather do a buyout and make it go away. But if a homeowner has flood insurance and has access to his ICC money, and he wants to stay where he is, it's not uncommon. A homeowner will say, I love my home, I love my neighbors, I want to elevate my house. And so it's on him to elevate it. Our floodplain regulations allow a substantially damaged property to be elevated if it's the owner's desire to do that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. One follow-up. Have you noticed that the floodplain map on the 100-year has changed quite a bit here in the Sequatchie Valley over the last 15 years?
Yes, absolutely. We were working based on a set of 2001 maps when the flood occurred in 2010.
Yes.
And we have a continuous program working with the Nashville District Corps of Engineers. They do all of our hydraulic and hydrologic modeling. And so in 2017, we had new maps issued. And in a lot of cases, there were multiple new creeks modeled and mapped that had never been mapped before. In a lot of cases, they were updated to reflect the fact that if you've got a basin, for example, that's built out over the 10-year to 20-year period, there's a lot more impervious surface in the area, more roadways, more asphalt parking lots, more big box stores, what have you. It'll change. It'll change, and it'll cause your 100-year level perhaps to rise some. We had reaches of the Cumberland River in downtown Nashville where it actually dropped a foot. So it's not universally going to just rise. It may change based on, and also the state of Tennessee has completed a statewide LIDAR flight. They have flown and mapped communities, all communities across the state of Tennessee, and it's easier now to model and to map communities that had never been modeled or mapped before. We had just last week the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Management conference took place in Knoxville, and there was a presentation about some of the base level engineering work. A community without good maps can request a base level engineering project be done by FEMA. And while we may not identify all the floodways in the creeks, we may be able to provide enough information based on that statewide LIDAR to enable you to have a much more effective tool to use to manage the construction of new properties, new structures in the floodplain. So there's a lot more opportunity, but to your question, yes, we're seeing more and more extreme events. We had a 10-inch rain in September. We had another 8 to 10-inch rain in March. We had another, 17-inch rain in 12 hours in Waverly in late August. These freak events are happening more and more frequently, and ultimately, the tool that's used to model is called Atlas 14. That's a tool that's a statistical document that tells you what your 100-year storm events are based on. We're going to see some 500-year events. What we know today is 500-year events become 100-year events, and that will necessitate a much more rigorous regulation of areas along floodplains.
Any other questions out there for any of our panelists? You could also put them in the chat if you would like.
I was just going to say one other thing, Logan, that on Christiana's, I really like Florida, what they're doing. They're stepping up.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good work in that.
They are. That's
in that bill. But we're interested in how they're using the funds from the American Recovery Plan.
Exactly.
It's a creative application and
Yes.
really much needed there.
Thank you.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, then we will give y'all some time back this afternoon. But if anything comes up in the hours after you're thinking about what we've heard today, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the other speakers that have presented today, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. Also, be looking for some updates from Flood Ready Tennessee in the coming days. And if you are interested in officially joining the coalition as well, you can visit floodreadytn.com to learn more about some of the priorities that we're working on, and you can join the coalition there. Thanks, Roger and Tony and Christiana and Mayor Reels and Mayor Land for taking the time out today. And we look forward to working together to make Tennessee more resilient against flooding. So hope to see everyone in person or over Zoom again soon.
Hope that you really enjoyed our episode here at AAA Live, where your academic goals are advanced and achieved. So we're airing every Wednesdays from 8 to 9 p.m. So you can like, follow, and subscribe to all our social media platforms here at the Education Channel on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, of course. So till next time, we had some very interesting guests for today discussing about outdoor education, of course, our concern for a flood-ready coalition in the state of Tennessee in the United States. And of course, we'd like to invite everyone to become virtual interns, specifically for the Education Channel and our corporate sponsors. So till next time, and this is Attorney Amian April M. Alcazar, your host. Stay safe and healthy, everyone, and good night.